So today's webinar is about project budget management in OpenAir. And if you joined our webinar last week, we talked about budget in two different ways, which was really about money and hours. But the topic is so broad when you talk specifics about system features. I decided on this one we're going to focus on the money aspect of it and some of the features that you can leverage in OpenAir to understand tracking budget, reporting against budget, predicting burn against budget, and so we're going to focus a lot on that. I do have a few slides, but I'm going to primarily be in an OpenAir environment doing things real time. Okay. So just for those of you who haven't joined our webinars in the past, we mute the lines so we can get through the material and the demo information in about 30 minutes. And then at that time I'm going to stop the recording and open up the phone line so that you guys can ask some questions. We can have some dialogue for another up to like 15 minutes if anyone is. I'll talk as long as everyone has time available. All right. So as I get going, I would like to kind of give a recap of what's going on with us and where you may see us in the world. So believe it or not, it's already the middle of September. It's kind of hard to believe how fast the year's gone by. We only have 2 more user groups currently scheduled for the rest of this year. The one in September is in Washington, D.C. Our friends at Delta Risk are going to host that in their Arlington office. So next Friday I will be there. So if anyone happens to be in town, would love to see you. Let us know if you can attend. And then the last one of the year currently is scheduled for Friday, October 13th. I realize that's the Friday the 13th, but we'll give it a go. And that will be in San Francisco. We don't have an official location yet or a hosting facility yet to do that, but I will be reaching out to our contacts and friends in that area and see if there's anyone that's willing to host it for us. Our webinar series, we don't have all the webinars posted yet on our website for next quarter. We're sort of revising the content. But for October, we're definitely going to be talking about timesheets. The last time we did the sort of an advanced timesheet webinar was probably about 3 years ago, so we thought it would be a nice refresher to revisit that topic. That will be on Thursday, October 12th. And then we are sponsoring the TSW conference in October in Las Vegas, so if you will be planning to attend that event, we'd love for you to stop by the expo and say hi, so we will have a booth there. Okay, now let's just jump into it, right? So the budget approaches and best practices area of this part of the presentation, we're going to focus on the money budget management. So what kind of funding do we have? Where are we at as far as the burn of the funding? Of course, that does break down into hours and expenses and stuff like that. But we also want to be able to track, where's our budget according to the types of money we have, whether it's for labor, expenses, subcontractors, materials, and also the timeline. Are we burning fast? Are we burning slow? And where does it look like we're going to end up at the end of the project? So that's what we're really going to focus on in this session. I'll be, like I said, jumping into the system as I introduce individual features and topics. I always think in terms of budget management, there's sort of a real basic level of, sort of the, when you learn how to budget manage as a kid, you get allowance, and then, you go up and you try to buy candy, and I have 50 cents. How much candy can I buy? That's sort of the basic budget management. And then it goes to the more advanced, I'm planning out every trip, every head count, every hour, and I'm checking to see how we're burning against that original plan, that sort of baseline, making adjustments along the way, and sort of forecasting based on the current burn, where are we going to end up. So that's sort of more project management, more large project management aspects, and so we're going to touch on sort of that whole gamut, because OpenAir as a system can handle all those different variations. So we're going to start with the kit and the allowance and the candy purchase one. This is the basic budget management. So many systems, many of you who may have just recently adopted OpenAir, this may be what you're starting with. It is a perfectly fine budget management. You basically have 2 fields that you fill out. How much money am I getting for this project, and how many hours am I getting for this project? And those are the budget fields that you find on your project properties form. It's very simple budget management. It captures the essentials, and it does support some basic reporting that allows you to leverage forecasting features in OpenAir and be able to see how you're doing against your budget in the system. So I'm going to jump into the system actually. And for our purposes of our demonstrations today, I have a project called Technical Assessment Delivery. It's not very exciting as far as the complexities of the project, but I made the budget a little bit more complex. It has just a single task on it. It's got a budget of 250 hours on it. Okay. So this project has a project budget of $50,000 and another $15,000 in expenses. So that totals to a total of $65,000 of budget. Now in the basic budget model, I would just type in $65,000, and I don't have any intelligence in that number other than it's a total of $65,000. So at this point with this basic budget management, what ends up happening, let me make this a little bit bigger. What ends up happening is many of you who are at this level, you're defining what does the budget money field mean, and you may be using it just to capture labor or revenue from labor so that the expenses are passed through, you don't care about it. So really understanding what this number represents is key if you're at the basic budget model. And I wrote a simple little report where you can pull the basics from the system and kind of highlight some of the basic reporting values that you may or may not be aware of in the system when you have a simple budget. Things like not only what the budget hours and budget money is at the project form, but there's some standard detail fields that you can pull into reports that really report on current burn against budget for cost and against budget for invoicing. And they rely on the invoice aspect of the system, not the revenue aspect. But here, like total income, I did generate an invoice against this. I have some hours against this already. And you can see so far I've invoiced $20,000 against my budget of $65,000, so that gives me a profit of $52,000 so far, and 81% of the budget is remaining based on that. And at this point, so 81% of the cost of the budget. I don't really like this metric, but it's available for reporting. And then the income versus the budget, I still have $44,000 of budget left, and I've only burned 32% of the budget so far on the project. And these are standard values that are available to include in the report. They're not actually a date range dimension. It's as of right now. This is where you're at with the project. And then, of course, you can bring in other things that are more date range oriented, like how much have you invoiced to date? Where are you from a projections perspective? Where would you end up at the project from a total forecast perspective? And based on the information I have in the system of scheduled hours and timesheets, I can see that I'm actually forecasting to come in at $50,785, which is under my budget of $65,000. And that's just basic, right? So I'm entering literally two values on the project form, but I still can get some pretty robust reporting because there are other things that you're doing in OpenAir. You're doing things like forecasting with charge projections. You're scheduling people out for work, so that's where the forecast money comes from. You're doing actual invoicing or pro forma invoicing to get the actuals, and then you just add forecast and actuals together to get your total view. Right. An extended budget feature is really a feature that this is the only sort of other budget option up until recently. It's called the budget transaction feature now, or transaction budget feature. I can't remember. It's changed names a little bit. It is an internal switch to turn on. But this feature is, this is sort of a basic next step for budget management. And what I really like this feature, but what this feature provides is a way to define what does $65,000 mean, and you can break it up into pieces, into categories of what the budget means. So it is an internal switch. You ask for the budget transaction feature, and when it's turned on, it's something that shows up under the financials drop-down in the menu inside your project. Okay. When this feature is turned on, the budget field, the budget money field on the project properties form becomes a read-only field because it is populated based on the values and transactions that you enter into the budget field. Let me see if I have an example on the next screen. Okay, I'll show you in here. So this budget field, what it allows you to do is you can actually track individual lines that represent, this is a labor budget, this is an expense budget, and you can associate that with the services, and the services that you may be familiar with, because those are the things that you tag on billing rules and revenue rules to do financial reporting. So the budgets can have the service on it, so you can tie everything together. Here's what my individual budget is. Here's where I'm burning from a revenue and invoice perspective on a report. So I'm going to jump back in the system at this point and show you on our little test project here. Under the financials menu, I have the budget feature. And I have two simple rows of budget. If I open up any of these values, you can see I created this budget. It's $50,000, and that's my service value. And these categories are whatever you want to define. But here you could do things like tracking change orders or tracking materials or subcontractor pass-through. And these would be ways that you could pull information from the system about the kind of budget you're dealing with. And then there's also another field that would have the service associated with that. So if I come here, okay. So you can see that I've taken that $65,000, I've added a little bit of intelligence, not much, but a little bit. So now I know that I don't have $65,000 in budget. I have $50,000 for time and $15,000 for expenses. Okay. And then what I can do is I can run reports that are a little bit more detailed, a little bit more intelligent. Sorry, let me get into that. That still can roll things up from a budget perspective, but now I have an ability to break it down by like service category. So I have this little timeline budget value report. And this report is another one of these inception to date, so I'm pulling everything into this report from the beginning of the project to the end of next year. And if you look, I'm able to bring things in at a project level, still have my total budget amount, my total invoice. These are all things that we saw on the previous one, budgeted, billing, total billing. But now I can also break this down into how much of this is expenses and how much of this is services or OpenAir consulting in this case. And that gives me more information. Just because I burned 30% or 33% of the budget does not necessarily mean I'm 30% done. I'm about probably a quarter of the way done with labor, but I've only burned like a third of the travel type stuff. So it gives you a little bit more information about what you're tracking. Okay. And then I also threw in some custom calculations to factor in margin. So margin is based on actuals at this time, the amount I've invoiced, the cost of those items, and then being able to factor in what the percentage is to date of the project. Now, with this margin, I'm doing this as of today based on actuals, and you'll notice that the line that has the expenses on it is all zero. So I purposely excluded expenses from my margin report. In this case, in this system, it's a pass-through. It's dragging down my margin percentage, but I could certainly factor it in if I wanted to. Okay. But then, so that's good that I'm seeing, okay, at this point, here's where I am with the project and the margin. But really, to do proper budget management, I need to see where am I going to end up? Where am I forecasting this project to go? And am I going to be able to stay within budget? So here's where you can factor in your charge projections feature and pull in more like projected cost, projected billing, projected fees, and come up with projected margin. And in this case, based on the way I've scheduled my resource over time, I'm projecting that we're going to burn another $20,000, and the margin is going to come in at 25, which means I'll end up at 55% margin. So I'm actually pretty much trending the right margin now. And in the future, it looks like I'm going to end up at 55. Now, on a time and material, this is a real simple example. To be completely open, I have one person, so one bill rate, one person. But this is a much more exciting report when you're dealing with multiple people at differing rates and differing costs, and therefore the calculations could swing greatly depending on how you've scheduled that resource to do future work. From a 54, it could drop down to 23 based on projections, or as high as 75 depending on where you're expecting costs to come in. But this budget management feature, I like it because it's very simple. It's very logical, I think, to be able to break budget down into components. And the nice thing about it is there's a time dimension to the budget feature. So if I go back to this budget feature, you'll notice that both of these entries have September 14th on it. When you include budget into a timeline report, you will be able to see the budget hit the report based on the date of this budget entry. So if I look at the same report, but it's a timeline weekly report, now instead of looking at a snapshot of total picture view, total end game view, I'm looking at, for this week, how much money have I made from a margin perspective and earned as far as billing is concerned. The reason I'm showing you guys this is that this budget approach has a slight limitation in the fact that it can't really keep up with a weekly view. You have to keep using inception to date view reporting, because you'll see here week 1 I have no budget. So of course how how am I doing against the $0 budget? I have no budget on the week of the 6th or the 13th. I have no budget up until, you guys guessed it, until the 14th, because that's when I put the transactions in. So this works great when you have reports that say, okay, at the beginning of the project I got $65,000, and then I have a change order 3 months later and I add more budget in and I put a date in for that, and you can see how it impacts margin over time. But in this situation, it's very awkward to report on a weekly report with this budget value being dated halfway through where people are doing the work. So the date is very important on these budget transactions, and it's hard to do a week over week view. What you end up having to do is changing your reporting values to be a week inception to date, so more of an accumulation type report to accommodate the varying, so the fact that these are single transactions over time. So you would use like a weekly ITD. And then when you run that, the first few weeks are still going to be blank because they're all dated September 14th. But once I hit the September 14th week and go forward, you'll see that the value is persistent. Sorry for making you guys dizzy. So it shows up here like I showed you before, but now the following week it stays there, and it stays there, and it stays there. So it makes sense to include it in a report then. Okay. Now the last budget feature, so I like this feature. It's simple, but we have to keep it in touch with the fact that it's got a single transaction with a single date. So we have to make sure we accommodate that in reports. Now the next feature is the project budget feature. So this feature came out about, I want to say, a couple years ago now, and its focus was cost planning. But like anything in OpenAir, you can define what you want the number to mean. So what I like to use this for is, if you're not going to do cost planning, I like to use it for a forecast or like a revenue plan or a burn plan of things. And when you set it up, you basically set it up to say, I have $50,000 of labor and I have $15,000 of expenses, and I just spread it across the timeline that I expect to burn it. And this is more like a spreadsheet grid that, some of you who may have been project managers may have had this kind of spreadsheet in the past. And it actually is nice to do it in the OpenAir system now for, I would think, primarily for larger projects actually, just because there's time to set it up. Okay. But what it allows you to do is you actually have the ability to add budget lines into the budget. So you add expenses, you can categorize it by the type of expense, and you can identify how much of that expense is going to be expended on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, a quarterly basis, and it really gives you that expense plan that you can't really get anywhere else in the system without doing some kind of jumping through hoops. But you can also take and do the same thing with the labor, and you can really focus it more on like services or job codes. So I need this much burn of a senior consultant, or I need this much burn of a consulting service, and that allows you to plan out your budget across the timeline. Okay. And as you're entering it, it actually is as simple as tabbing into a cell and typing into it and hitting save. So there's been many enhancements to this feature to make it very usable, very interactive on things. And I did take the liberty of adding one of these to our test project. Okay. So these two budget features can coexist, where you have sort of a high-level budget value, but you can also do a project budget feature. They actually are very independent of each other. Okay. So I created a budget entry here, and the budget entry, when I set it up, I said, what the value of it is. It's $65,000. I just happen to know that it's $50,000 in labor and $15,000 in expenses. From a budget overview perspective, you can see that I said it was $65,000. And it will tell me how much of that $65,000 I've planned out. So you can see the $64,200 is what I've actually planned. So I'm not planning to burn the whole $65,000 at this point. Okay. And then it will keep track of, so that's the remaining amount. Then as far as budget infos and settings, this allows you to have some basic information about when was this created, when was the last time it was updated. There is an approval process function that you can attach to your project budget, so you can have your PMs, for example, have a budget and then submit it for review and have it be approved by a PMO or a director or something like that, if you want to have that kind of check and balance control in the system. Okay. And then some other options, such as being able to link it to existing documents like customer POs or agreements, being able to import functionality or import settings already, like I want to, where's my import option? Let me change it to a little bit smaller here. Okay. I want to be able to import from my existing bookings or my existing task assignments. So if you've spent time building out your project plan in the system or your resource plan in the system, you don't have to manually create your project budget. You can just do an import action and it'll populate everything based on what you've already put in the system from a resource scheduling perspective. Of course, there's nothing to populate from an expense perspective or a purchases perspective, but at least you would get the labor pre-populated. But in this case, what I did is I actually created 2 lines, and I said this project goes from August 1st to October 31st, and I planned out how much, what the expenses should be week over week. So I actually set everything up at weekly. So now I'm looking at it on a weekly basis. And I said, here's my airfare line. I did an add, and I added airfare, and I said I expect airfare is going to be, in this case I think I said $800, and I want to do $800, every couple of weeks. And that gave me a timeline that I filled out, and then I went through and I refined it, and I said, for this airfare line, I expect the first trip to be the week of July 30th, $800, then 2 weeks later, then 2 weeks later. You could see I sort of planned out the trips. Here I expect 2 people to travel, 1 person, 2 people. That's just my numbers in my head of, I think it's about $800 a flight. And then I added additional lines for each trip that would make sense to track if I was doing a trip plan. So business meal estimate, ground transit, lodging, throw parking in here or something. But this was my plan of burn. And then I did the same thing with labor, saying, okay, well, I expect to burn so many hours a week or so many hours a month. So you can actually flip between an hours view and a money view. So if I switch to the hours view, you can see I planned 16 hours the first week, 6, 24, and so forth until I exhausted the $50,000 of plan. Okay. So now I have this nice spreadsheet in the system But how the heck do I factor this into reporting, and how do I measure my budget or manage my budget from this? So I wrote some reports. So here's a similar type report that we've been seeing, but I'm actually pulling a reporting value called the project budget labor and project budget expenses into my grand scheme of reporting. So here's my total labor budget, $50,000. Here's my total expenses budget, $14,200 so far. And then here's what I've invoiced so far and my margin based on that. So you can see these are different reporting values coming directly from that feature, and I can factor that into custom calculations along the way if I'd like. Okay. I can also do the forecasting. Again, the forecasting independent of the project budget, but it gives me the ability to pull all that information into one report. Now, you're probably already ahead of me where I'm going to go with this last report example, and that's the fact that, well, what if I wanted to look at it week over week? So you saw the big benefit of the project budget feature versus the standard budget transaction feature in the fact that I actually can have a budget week over week, specifically for that week, and I can look at that information on a weekly basis. I'm not required to do a week inception to date type view. So I can see sort of a run rate budget comparison, actuals versus plan. And for many of you that we've worked with, actual versus plan a lot of times was hours based. I have so many booked hours or assigned hours versus my timesheets. Now you can turn that into a money actuals versus plan by using this project budget feature. And week over week you can just compare how much labor am I expecting, how much expenses I am expecting, how much have I invoiced, and what's my margin. And you could add things like how much did I expend in invoice fees and invoice expenses, or actual fees and actual expenses. So if I do like invoice, because I've already run some invoicing in the system. Invoice expenses and invoice fees, and let me just bring that next to each other here. So put the invoice fees next to my budget and my budget labor next to my invoice fees here. And those of you who may not be familiar with where I am in the system, this is the report management interface. So if you're not using this feature, I do recommend it. We do have a free ebook on our website on how to sort of get your mind around the old interface to this new one, because it's quite nice actually. So you see here's the same report week over week, but if you see like the week of, let's do this week here, week of starting 8/13, I expected to burn 4,800. I only burned 3,400. And I expected to burn 1,500 in expenses, and I only burned 945. So now I can see it week over week. Am I burning hot, burning cold? I can graph this if I want. I'm not limited to doing a accumulated report over time. Okay, so that's really sort of the the catalog version of project budget management. I would reserve it really for the larger projects, the multi-year projects, because that is something that you would get a better benefit out of that as well, and you can copy budgets from project to project. Now, I also consider using the project budget as like a baseline. So there is a baseline feature in OpenAir. The baseline feature sort of snapshots the task plan, and you can run variance reporting from it. But really, the benefit of a variance report is seeing what was the original value versus the current value. Even if they're matching, I want to see them side by side. And the project, I view the project budget feature as almost something like that, where I can go into the project, I can look at things on a monthly basis, and I can just click on this Actuals tab. And what will happen is it will bring back the actuals as compared to the plan, and I can see everything from this view already. So here's the total view, plan versus actual, and plan versus actual along the way month by month. Okay. So really, the level of budget management, you do have to ask the question of, do you have a standard approach? Is it variable based on the size of the project? Is there a feature that you want everyone to use, and then the budget features and the project budget features are something you use for the larger projects? So there are some design decisions or decision considerations for the actual features that you want to use. But there's at least those 3, and of course there's other ones that you can come up with as far as custom calculations in the system to be able to do some report-based budget management. So as we run into the summary, I'm going to be stopping the recording here shortly, but just know that there are quite a few features related to budget, and the project budget feature is one of the newer ones that really has been enhanced over the past few releases to capture a lot of functionality and really give you that good insight into where you're going as far as driving the project. Okay. So with that, I'm going to stop